Welcome to this week's lecture. It's week 11, Children with Special Needs. So I still work within this field, so it's definitely something that I wanted to talk about. So a lot of times I've skewed the discussion towards typically developing children. And so the first part of this class was a couple of weeks of just like typical development or milestones that should be reached, and things that you could do if they weren't reaching their milestones, or ways to be concerned if they weren't reaching their milestones. So now in this kind of second part after spring break, I'm talking a little bit more about special issues, children, bilingual children, adverse childhood experiences, and some of them are children with special needs. So I'm really going to go over kind of special education and kind of the formal process of it, some racial disparities within special education, and then how our special education system is set up for ages 0 to 3, and then ages 3 years old to 21 years old. And that's kind of when you age out of the education part of special education, and you would be kind of within social services. So some children will require accommodation and intervention for a variety of special needs. And so we really need to have, and I think we've made big inroads in having a process of identification. So by educating people about milestones and educating pediatricians about milestones, because a lot of pediatricians or people who work in pediatric health know a lot about child health and growth, but maybe development is something, it's actually, they only receive, I think it's like 20 hours of lecture in child development. So you will know more about child development than the actual pediatrician when you graduate with a human development degree from Cal State, because you've taken a lot of different classes in this. So it's a process of educating people in health and educating parents to say, hey, they're not reaching their milestones, or we need to identify why this child isn't learning the way that they're supposed to. And then we need to assess in a formal process. So it can't just be the identification process, hey, they're not meeting their milestones. It needs to be, in what way are they not meeting their milestones? What age level are they at? So for example, in my work, I do a report each month, every 6 months on children that I work with. And I'll say in fine motor, so the ability to use your fingers, this child is 25 months old chronologically, but developmentally they are at 9 months old. So this gives the social services regional center who handles, who's a vendor kind of for the county, who handles all of that type of stuff. And then education systems like your local school district, that gives them information on what the child can do so that they can make provision of service. So at 2.5, when my children are getting ready to exit regional center for 0 to 3 services, they'll go to their local school district, and the school district will say, okay, yeah, so your fine motor and your speech are about a year younger than it should be. The services that you will need to have will be occupational therapy and speech therapy. So we'll go over a wide range of special education systems and things like that. But I do want to point out that it can be anywhere from moderate to severe. We do feel really comfortable with the idea of a spectrum. So for autistic children, there's a spectrum of high functioning to low functioning. It's the same with special education. They are going to meet the needs of any child. For some children, they need, like my daughter has a speech delay, it's for articulation. She has a lot of words. She talks to me all day long, but her R's, her S's, her T's, she can't say them as well. It's adorable, but when she's 19, it will probably be less adorable. So we want to make sure that she can articulate and she can say all those sounds so that people in the community can understand her when she talks. And then there could be children, like I have children that are 3 years old, they can't eat, they can't sit up, they can't make sounds, they're blind, they might be deaf, they have significant life impairments in all areas of domain. So from the child who needs a lot of intervention, a lot of accommodation in order to do anything, all the way to children who just need a little bit of therapy in order to articulate better, or to hold a pencil correctly, something like that, and they can still be mainstreamed in education system. So there's a spectrum of special needs that we can come across, and we can also kind of make sure that we accommodate and intervene as much as possible. I think a big thing that I want to bring up as well is that we need to honor the parents as the child's first teacher and allow them to advocate for their child. So especially because I'm with 0 to 3, I work with the family primarily. Like I teach the family how to hold their child, how to roll their child on an exercise ball in order to increase trunk and core space strength. Or how to work with their child so that we can start prompting some words so that a 2.5-year-old can start to use more, or mine, or you, or something like that. But we definitely, especially in the under 3, we really honor the parents as that first teacher. And then in the older, the older the child gets, they might be less involved. So the child goes to the school district, they get a lot of therapies, the parents might not be present. But we allow them to advocate for what their child needs, and we want to encourage them to advocate so that their parents can get them the appropriate accommodation and intervention. I do want to talk about special education in the United States. So 8.5% of the population receives some kind of disability services under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And it has to be reenacted by Congress every so often, and it typically always has been since the 1970s in various iterations. So they might change things to make them more appropriate as we learn more about special education. But these are the kind of the rates is of that 8.5%, 35% of them are specific learning ability, 20% is speech and language impairment, 13% is an other health impairment, 9% is autism. I actually thought that number would be higher. 6% is an intellectual disability, 6% is developmental delay, 3% is emotional disturbance, 5%, I'm sorry, and then 2% is multiple disabilities. So I do want to define some of these for you. Instead of, I kind of was like, oh, I'll talk about cerebral palsy, then I'll talk about autism, then I'll talk about this, because I have a lot of experience with each of those themselves. And then I thought, you know what, that's probably a little bit less helpful for you guys. I want to talk about it as a system as a whole because we've been learning research methods. So having some vocabulary, having some ideas about how we provide services in this country will probably be more helpful for you. I know a lot of you are future nursing students, therapists, educators, social services, things like that. So knowing about the system, I hope will help you in the future in order to be able to understand how we provide services for children with special needs in the United States. So a specific learning ability, that's from, so what I'm going to do, sorry, let me go back. I'm going to define all of these for you. So I've given you the rates, and now I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you what a specific learning ability is. It's a basic psychological process involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written. And so this would be auditory processing disorders, sensory disorders, dyslexia, things like that. So learning or the ability to learn is being impacted for some reason. Either auditory processing is you can hear, but then within your brain in some way gets scrambled. I have a nephew who has an auditory processing. He's completely mainstreamed. There are just a couple little accommodations that he receives from his full-time teacher in the class. A sensory processing where one of the 5 senses that you have is in some way affected by it. And then dyslexia, you kind of flip your numbers or your letters, things like that. So that's a wide variety of learning disabilities within this kind of umbrella term, and that your learning or your cognitive ability is somewhat changed by one of these conditions that you have. Another health impairment, asthma, attention deficit disorder, a heart condition, ADHD, Tourette's syndrome, anything that's health issue related that would make you be tired or not have as much strength or not be able to participate fully within the life of your school would be a health impairment, and you would have the nurse be involved in the care of that. So I had an IEP as a child because I had asthma really bad in my elementary school days, and then I got to get out of a lot of PE. I didn't have to run around the track. I still had to participate, but you know where you have to like run around the track twice. I usually got to get out of that. And people thought that I was making it up, but I legitimately have asthma and things like that. Now I love to run. I ran 5 miles yesterday. I always have an inhaler with me, but I definitely grew out of it. Then there's autism, and a lot of us are very specific, know about this, and I know some of you have already reached out to me wanting to write your policy paper about this. But social skills, repetitive behaviors, a delay in speech and nonverbal communication. And then this is straight from Autism Speaks, which is a little bit of a controversial organization for children with autism or people with autism. But I do like that they focus on the unique strengths and differences of people with autism. I think a lot of times we see autism as this huge disorder or this delay, but there are some unique strengths and differences that people with autism have, and we should honor that as well. Intellectual disability is a disability characterized by significant limitations in intellectual functioning or cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior like life help skills. You know, being able to use the restroom, get on a bus, cook, things like that. Everyday social and practical skills, and this has to be something before the age of 18. In order to get this specific disability, you can have your cognitive and intelligent functioning and adaptive behaviors changed. Like as an adult, you could get hit on the head, have post-traumatic, have a tumor, something like that affects your intellectual disability. But for this specific one, it needs to be something that you were born with or you had developed before the age of 18. Then there's a developmental delay, and that's a delay in one or more areas of development. And that's the children that I see. So I see children 0 to 3, and they'll have a developmental delay of, and we do a percentage of 25%, 33%, 50%, whatever it is, in specific areas of development. It's physical development, fine motor, gross motor, self-help, emotional, and communication. Those are kind of the big areas. So if you have a delay in one of those or in any other development, then you could also get an IEP. So for my daughter, she had a developmental delay in communication, and it was her articulation of sounds. I'm going to talk about emotional disturbances in another slide, and then there's multiple disabilities. So special needs that are characterized with more than one disability. So you could be, so for example, I have a child who has cerebral palsy, and she has this very rare, like 1 in 7 million people have it. So there's only 12 documented cases in the whole United States of this very specific syndrome. But she also has cerebral palsy as well, and that affects her development in all areas. Can't sit up, can't eat, can't talk, things like that, and that's why she has multiple disabilities. An exception is deafness and blindness. Deafness and blindness have their own accommodation systems within our within educational systems. So if you are deaf or blind, we have great services and great wraparound services for children and adults. Emotional disturbances. I did want to talk a little bit more about this. It's a condition where, because I think we're getting more aware of mental health issues, and I hope we are becoming more aware of mental health issues for children. So if you have a emotional issue that affects your educational performance, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this, but inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings. So if you have like oppositional defiant disorder, you're throwing chairs across the room, breaking the tip of your pencil sends you into a rage, or somebody touches you and you haul off and shove them every single time. That's one example of it. It can also be an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships. So if you have a really hard time talking to other people, dealing with like muteness. So I had a child who had selective muteness. He would not talk to anybody who wasn't a close family member or family friend. It took me about 2 years. He talked to me for the first time when I had been coming to the house twice a week for 2 years, and then he started talking to me. That was like a big milestone for me, as I almost felt like I was part of the family at that point, and that he was able to talk to me. First grade teacher, nope. Gym teacher, aide, principal, 30 kids in his class, nope, he was not going to do that. That affected his interpersonal relationships. It affected his ability to learn. He couldn't be in a group project. He couldn't say if the answer was right or wrong, anything like that. And then it's also a catch-all for an inability to learn that's not explained by like a developmental delay, a sensory delay, a health delay, multiple disabilities, anything like that. So if a child can't learn and there's an emotional component to it, and we can't put it in any other category, it could be this. I like also that we're starting to talk about unhappiness, depression, anxiety, and that can affect young children, and that can be an emotional disturbance that can affect our learning ability. And then it also can be schizophrenia and things like that. And we're going to talk, our paper this week is going to be on schizophrenia and children as well. As always, I do like to point out that there are huge racial disparities. So last time I talked about this was in prenatal care, because it's definitely affecting our ability of mothers to give birth safely and then children to be born safely, is what racial makeup you have, which is a shame in this country that your ethnic or racial identity can affect the kind of healthcare or education that you receive. So we know that almost 9% of children are in special education programs of some sort. It's much, much higher if you're a Native American, Indigenous, First Nations, American Indian, anything like that, or if you're an African American or Black student. So those much more exceed the national average. So if we were looking at just Native American students, we would think, okay, 8% of kids in this racial group should have special education services. If it's 8.5, this is at 13.3. So it's almost double that, which is huge. And then African American as well. Black students are often diagnosed with intellectual disabilities or emotional disabilities as well. Latino and white students mirror the national average, and then it's much less for our Asian students as well. So it actually should be a little bit higher for our Asian students if they were mirroring what we're seeing in all kinds of, so they're only 4.2 and the national average is 8.5, so it's less than that. My own aunt has seen this firsthand. She retired a couple of years ago in Florida, and she worked outside of Orlando. It's a very racially diverse area, lots of Caribbean, Spanish-speaking peoples, and then like Haitian and Native African American as well. And most of her class, she said, was minorities. And she would get so upset, and she would go storming into people's offices and demand that they take children out of her classroom. She felt that they were being unfairly identified. She felt that they were being assessed unfairly, and remaining in, because she did like an outside classroom. So these weren't children that were mainstream. This was a fully special education classroom. So you have to be quite moderate to severe to be in classrooms like that. And so she felt that her African American and Spanish speaking students were being unfairly targeted and placed and almost funneled into this. That's one person's experience in a state other than California. So we'll take that as kind of an incidental kind of case study, let's say. But we do know that there are racial and ethnic disparities in what African American and American Indian students are being placed at a higher average in our special education classrooms. And that's what this is talking about, is severe or moderate delays that then lead them to be not mainstream. So they're taken out of their classroom in order to be given education. And from that point, we don't know if they will get a diploma at all. They might not, they will graduate, but you might not have a diploma or a GED, you'll get a certificate or something like that. And that will have consequences in your lifespan, and that you might not be able to find employment and things like that. I do want to talk about the actual federal law, which like I said, was Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea. So it's been around from the 70s, and we have to kind of vote on it every year. So our members of Congress need to vote on it every year. So we need to make sure that what it is it's really, that it's important, because it protects 6.5 million children across the United States. So we need to make sure that it is as appropriate as possible. It's based on evidence and research that we are finding in our educational research. The two biggest things about it, and what I want you to take away from this lecture today, is that IDEA gives you free and appropriate public education. So you should have access to special education services and certified teachers. So people who have been trained in how to handle special education, or therapists who have been trained in speech or physical issues or occupational issues, something like that. And then also education should take place in the least restrictive environment. And that's why my aunt would become so upset, is because a mainstream environment for somebody who has a low to moderate speech delay, and they are taken out of their regular classroom and not mainstreamed, is not least restrictive environment. So they were, in her mind, it was unlawful because people were being taken out by racial issues. Once again, this is her own kind of personal example, but we do need things to be least restrictive. So that's why I travel to people's homes. I work with 0 to 3. The least restrictive environment is the home environment where the child lives. By working with the families, I help the families support their education and development at home where the child is learning when they are an infant and toddler. We also need to make sure that it's free and appropriate public education as well. So here is an IEP. So if you have been identified as having a special need, you've been assessed, and you have a delay in an area, then this is what you do. You have an IEP, it's an individualized education plan, and this talks about specific goals that she would need. So for my daughter with her articulation issues, that she will say S sounds, correctly 75% of the time. It gets a little bit more technical than that, but that's an example of a goal that she has. So within 6 months, a year, something like that, she has these very specific goals. I go once a year and we talk about it. We have shared responsibility. I have a lot of participation in it. And then once again, it's in the least restrictive environment. So my daughter is taken out only for 30 minutes once a week in order to work on her articulation issues, and then she's back in her regular kindergarten environment. I like also that it should be based on individual strengths and needs. So not every child is the same. Not every child's disability is the same. So you could have autism, but within our spectrum, services that you need, goals that you need are going to be radically different depending on the child and their own strengths and differences. As the children get older, they need to have their adult outcomes planned. And then we also need to include positive behavior supports, especially if you have an emotional disturbance. We need to focus on positive guidance, positive support in order to make goals as necessary, to make goals based on your strengths and on your needs. So students and their disabilities. So once again, they need to have the ability to be in an LER, which is a least restrictive environment. So for most of our students, they're in a regular education more than 80% of the day. And that's 50% of the students that have an IEP, an individualized education plan. And then for some students, they're in a regular education classroom at least 40% of the day. And that's about 30% of students. So maybe a child with Down syndrome in 1st or 2nd grade could spend some of their time in their mainstream classroom with the rest of their typically developing peers, and then they might come outside for therapies or interventions or to learn adaptive skills as well in a special education classroom. And then about 20 to 25% of our students are outside of their regular classrooms. They're not mainstreamed. They're in special education classrooms, and those are for moderate to severe disabilities. Schooling types. So I do want to touch on this as well. So IDEA is a federal act. So it's not something that you can get out of with some provisions. So charter schools and magnet schools within, so San Diego has a lot. I think, that's a completely different lecture, is charter school, magnet schools, things like that. But they must provide services for children with special needs under IDEA. So if they were only taking typically developing children, that would place an unfair burden on the school district. And so they need to take children of all levels of ability and all developmental delays. Private schools do not have to take children with special needs. This is an issue, you should know what you're getting into. So if you're going to a private school, maybe it's the best fit for you. Maybe they have autistic services for your child that are fantastic. That's fine. As long as you are going in knowing your rights, knowing what you're giving up, knowing the services that you're receiving, those types of things, that's great, as long as the parents fully understand what they are getting and what they are not getting through a private school. I do want to bring this up because school vouchers have been more in the news. Our new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is a huge advocate for school voucher programs. So this would be to allow children in private schools using a voucher instead of going to a public school. My thing that I tell parents if they're looking at school voucher programs is you must investigate the private school and the special education provisions that private school has or does not have, because you can have due process and the federal requirements about special education, they change in a voucher or private programs. Due process is if you don't agree with the services that your child has, you can go through this process in order to kind of air your grievance about it. So if you think that your child is getting speech therapy, but they need speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy, but they're not getting it, you could go through the process of due process. You could go through and get due process in order to possibly get those services for your child. You typically don't have due process in a private school. So if you are agreeing to go to a public school, you might just be stuck with what the management of that school decides to give you. Once again, it might be in your child's best interest if they have a great program for special education, but you need to know that you might be giving up due process, as well as the fact that how they provide special education in private schools will not be regulated by the federal government. So I think it's an eyes wide open. Parents need to go in knowing that if they are going to use school vouchers, that it might change the education that their child receives depending on the special need that their child has as well. So I want to talk about IEPs and individualized education plans. So the IEP is individualized education plan. That's on the right-hand side. It's for children ages 3 to 21. It focuses on the child's needs. The services are provided at the school. So even if you're taken out of your mainstream classroom and put in a special education classroom, it's still at your school environment. You don't have a service coordinator though, but you do have a team of people who review it at least one time a year. It's typically twice a year. They'll send papers home that you can look at and see what your child's progress is. And then once a year you go in and you have a big meeting. It typically has somebody from management, a vice principal or a principal, somebody taking notes about what everybody's saying, and then the therapists that are involved. So when I went, it was just me, the therapist, and somebody taking notes. For somebody who has multiple disabilities or emotional disturbance, it will require a lot more therapists and a lot more teachers to have an input on it. The IFSP is what I deal with professionally, and that's the Individualized Family Service Plan, and this is for birth through age 3. We call it Family Service Plan because it's inclusive of the family needs. When you're an infant and toddler, you're very enmeshed in your family's life. You're learning at home from your family, so it's what the family and the child need. It's in your natural environment, which is most likely your home environment. You have a service coordinator through a regional center you meet with every 6 months, and that's when we go over goals as well. And then at 2.5, you start to transition so that by 3, you're getting an IEP if necessary. So goals and outcomes. The biggest thing with IFSPs or IEPs, they might have different words. In IFSPs, it's an outcome or an objective. In an IEP, it's a goal or an objective. But the same thing is it's measurable and attainable goals for the family, the child, and the service providers to agree upon once a year at a formal meeting. So you sit down with your service coordinator or the therapist or whoever it is, depending on your child and your child's age, and you talk about what do you want your child to achieve in a year? What makes sense? So if your child is completely nonverbal, in a year it's not going to make sense that they can have 2,200 words. We might be working in a year, your child's going to have 65 spontaneous words and they can put them together in 2-word utterances. That might be a goal or objective that you would agree on with your service coordinators and your speech therapists and your early interventionists if you have a 2-year-old. For a 7-year-old with autism, it might be to decrease repetitive behaviors such as rocking. It might be to have an awareness of other people's nonverbal communication, things like that. So it's going to change, but it is a formal process as well. And this is where we really want to advocate for our families. While I really believe that you get more flies with sugar or with honey than vinegar, so I think that being polite and going in with the best interests and wanting to work together as a team is always the best thing to do. The parents also need to know that at the end of the day, they are the advocate for their child. And if they don't feel that the services are appropriate for their child, then they need to advocate through this system in order to get what they need for their child. So once again, at a formal meeting, the parents should come in ready to talk about knowing goals and objectives that they have for their child, things that they can change. Know that you can speak up, that you can talk about it, that you can have an open communication with teachers, therapists, and the principals in order to get the best for your child. And that's what I tell all of the families that I work for, is you need to make sure that you're reading everything so that you can understand what your child's being offered, and is it appropriate for your child? You're your first child's teacher. We need to honor that. So 0 to 3 services, once again, it's an individualized family service plan. It's provided typically in a home environment or maybe a clinic for some therapies. Children receive behavioral support at this age as well. We have in-home behavioral supports. We have applied behavior analysis, ABA, which is typically for children who might be on the spectrum. And then at 2.5, we start you to transfer over to the IEP services, which is individualized education. It's free as well. It should be in a least restrictive environment within your school environment, mainstreamed or in a special education classroom. As you get older, though, as you're heading towards 16, 17, 18, and then it goes all the way to 21 years old, you should be working towards a diploma, a GED, a certificate. If you're not eligible for one of those, I worked with a family whose older brother was 30. Since he had left Poway High, he didn't leave with a diploma or a certificate, but he did have really supported job training so that he was able to be a bagger at Ralph's, and he was fantastic in it. He was a naturally social, wonderful person. And so as he was supported leaving high school, he was supported in getting job training in order to be a bagger at a grocery store, which gave him a job, employment, income of his own, and also that value and that like just kind of what we all need. We all want to feel like we're productive members of our society, and that's what we might want to be working towards with people who might have kind of more severe to moderate disabilities. They might not be going to college or to white collar work, but in a supported environment, they will be having some kind of job training. My husband's cousin is 22. So he actually just aged out of this last year. He's 22. He has the cognitive age of about a 3 or 4 year old. And so we realized years and years ago that we weren't going to be going towards a diploma or certificate. We were going for job training. So he works in a warehouse. He builds boxes and stuff like that, kind of like for Amazon. He's the person who makes the boxes, like actually makes them, takes them from 2D to 3D, and then passes them on to the pickers who then put things in. It's a great job. He likes it a lot. He's supported. He has a job coach who comes and checks on him, who makes sure that his job performance is what it is, handles any kind of interpersonal issues because sometimes his speech is difficult to understand. So he has a lot of support in order to go out and be successful. He loves his job. He, like, when he's sick, he wants to continue, like if he has a cold and everybody has to be like, no, you need to stay at home. He's like, but they depend on me, because it gives him this real motivation and this real kind of feeling that he's contributing. He's absolutely contributing to our economy. And so we love that he is able to have this kind of program. And that's why the to age 21 has been so helpful, is we were able to steer him away from a diploma, which at a 4-year-old cognitive level, he wouldn't have been able to do. He struggles with reading a lot. But we were able to get him into a supported job situation, which has been fantastic for the whole family. Okay, so once again, I have some great high-tech visual information for you guys. So this is the process of identifying an assessment. So it starts off with referrals submitted by a parent. So if you are noticing at a young age that your child is not meeting their milestones, or an educator in 2nd or 3rd grade, the teacher's telling you, man, he keeps slipping his letters, you know, let's go look for some assessment into dyslexia. Or a doctor as well. A doctor could say, you know, he's got scoliosis, asthma, ADHD, something like that. And this referral then goes to RC, which is Regional Center, which is the vendor for the county that helps with special education. It can go to First 5 as well, so they have a lot of services as well. Or an LEA is kind of your school district. So then your evaluation, it should be a very formal evaluation, and it should be comprehensive, looking at the strengths and the weaknesses that a child has, identifying what delays they have, what disability they have. So then we can see if they're eligible for services, and then give them the correct placement and service delivery. So that is the therapies and the educational system that they need to support them so that they can learn to their best of their ability. And then we reevaluate. So every year we reevaluate. We won't reevaluate. Sometimes we'll reevaluate if they're even eligible for services. Maybe they don't need speech or occupational therapy anymore. They're able to just be mainstreamed with no support. Or we can say, yes, this person is always going to be eligible for services, but they are going to change based on how the child grows and develops every year. So in conclusion, special education is a right. It's a federal right for all children in the United States. There are going to be variations on how it's implemented at the state level, the county level, and then just based on the individual needs of that child. It will be affected as the federal law changes, because this is something that has to be voted on and changed every year. For the most part, it's great. We're learning every year about special education. We're learning how to provide services for children. So every year, as we get this body of evidence from research models, we use that to change to add that to the federal law. So when idea comes up to be voted on, we can add things that are more appropriate to it. The Department of Education, so our Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is part of our Federal Department of Education, and they also issue guidelines about what they think is important, or they will sue or not sue and pursue legal due process against things that they are against or things that they are for. So the Department of Education and IDEA have a lot of impact in special education as well. But I think the most important thing is that it's a right, and it's an individual right that about 9% of the population of children needs to access. So I do want to talk about our PP model again. So this is a really interesting paper, and it's also going to be your weekly article reflection, and it's about early psychosis and then a public education program using this pre-seed proceed model. So once again, I've got the little visual for it. So our outcome, our quality of life, is that there's schizophrenia, or chronic schizophrenia is a functional disability. So within our epidemiology, this is from Canada, so they looked at the World Health Organization and they looked at Canadian incidences, so they have kind of their own CDC in Canada, and they're looking at incidences of schizophrenia. So how much of the population is affected worldwide and then Canadian by schizophrenia. So the World Health Organization identified schizophrenia as an important public health problem. Schizophrenia meets the 4 criteria in that it's a public health issue. It's frequent and it's widespread. It results in severe disability and suffering. I've had family members who have had schizophrenia, and there is definitely a lot of suffering at some points for this person. And then effective methods for dealing with the condition and the interventions can be difficult to come by and are not always acceptable to the patient, to the family, or the society. And so that's kind of the impact as well, is why the World Health Organization said that this was a public health action. So this is from the study as well, but I really like how they had this image talking about predisposing factors, enabling factors, and reinforcing factors that then impact the behavioral outcomes, health outcomes, and the quality of life. So we know that schizophrenia can give us a significant functional disability. So schizophrenia is you hear voices or you see things that are not there. So you kind of had a break with reality as we know it. Typically within a health outcome, if you have chronic schizophrenia, it can either be kind of gradual or it can be a sudden break with reality. But we know that recovery from that first psychotic episode can take years and years. I had a friend who had his first psychotic episode at 21, when we were 21, and it came on very suddenly, and he was hospitalized for about 2 years after, in and out of kind of mental health places, as we tried to get the right dosage, the right therapy model, all of those types of things. So it did really affect his health outcome as well. The medicine that he had to take as well, it either was very rapid weight loss or weight gain, depending on the type of medication, the type of activity that he had as well. So it affected a lot of his health outcomes. It also affected his behavioral outcomes as well, in that there was a delay in help seeking for symptoms of early psychosis. So we didn't even really notice the early signs of psychosis until he had his first kind of psychotic break. And then after that, it was a very long period in making sure that he had the right help and the right kind of treatment model that was best for him. So some factors that play into that are predisposing factors. So for knowledge, I was 21, I was still in college, I was still learning about this. I didn't have a lot of individual awareness, and we were very close friends. Same with his family, people that were in completely different industries who just kind of knew that something was a little bit off, but we weren't really sure what was happening. Then after the first psychotic break, kind of not knowing, you're just thrown into this kind of situation that you're really not aware of. So you're not sure about treatment models or anything like that. And so this is in Canada as well. So they have, what kind of services they have might be really different than what we have as well. And then how to access help if they suspect something is wrong. So you can get a 5150 hold, which is if you're a threat to yourself or others, and that's what he was placed on a couple of times. But sometimes he would just need help, but he wasn't a threat to anybody, but he definitely needed help. What kind of services did we access then? We didn't know. That was definitely a factor in getting him some health help, was we didn't know what to do next. Attitudes, values, and beliefs. A lot of times for him especially, he couldn't recognize that he thought the voices that he heard, because it was auditory, were real. So he could not recognize my voice versus a voice that was going on in his head, and so that was really difficult for him. A lot of times there was a fear of stigma or rejection, not wanting his parents, not wanting to like talk about this at work, like, I'm just taking time off, I just need a week off, at first, because hoping it would go away, and then that there was a stigma that you have a psychotic son, or he's a nutcase or a basket case or something like that. And then enabling factors as well. So this is that middle one, is there wasn't a like community awareness. So it wasn't something that I was aware of, and it wasn't something his parents were aware of, and it wasn't something that his like primary care physician, had like a couple phone numbers, but that was about it. We had to kind of be immersed in this system before we got the treatment help that he needed. Community awareness, doctor awareness, treatment service awareness, all of those things are enabling factors that enabled his health outcome and his behavioral outcome of getting the treatment that he needed. And then reinforcing factors, a lot of that was social stigma, of parents at first not wanting anybody to know, or only wanting certain people within our church community to know about it. And then cultural perceptions as well. We were in the same church, and we had grown up together. And so we were really lucky in that our church was fairly understanding of it, but we weren't really letting a lot of the older members know, because it wasn't something that at first we felt like the older people in our church community had a lot of understanding about. This was a very difficult thing for a lot of us to deal with. So it might depend on your community as well, or your culture or your race as well. What their perceptions are about mental illness could definitely be a reinforcing factor that then impact the kind of treatment that you get, the behavior outcomes and your health outcomes, and then eventually your quality of life as well. So I think this is a great article. So we're going to read this for our weekly article reflection as well. So you can read through it and you can get some more background information. Because I think psychosis is an emotional disturbance that affects how people learn within an educational system and within special education. And I like that we're having more of an awareness of mental health, and that mental health can have ramifications on all areas of development. And how, as public education, can we help and support students? And why I like the pre-seed proceed model is that it's not based on what I think, it's based on what the public does or does not know or understand or value or have knowledge or anything like that about a specific issue. And that's why this kind of has been picked as something that we'd like you guys to know about, is it's based on what the community needs, what the community knows, what administrative policies we have in place in order to kind of systematically guide change and concrete change and concrete process around a variety of health issues. And so in this case, psychosis is a disability that can affect us in all areas of development. How can we set up a public education program that can help people get to the root of the factors that impact their health outcomes and their behavior outcomes? That is it for this week. Thanks so much for watching our lecture. I will see you guys in the forum boards, and I will also be reading our weekly reflection papers on this psychosis issue. Have a